Well, from the Kennedy kids to the Bush babies, what must life be like if you call the White House home? Our next guest has devoted quite a lot of time to answering that very question. In his new book, All the President's Children, a former George Bush senior aide, Doug Wead, traces the history of presidential offspring. It is a fascinating read. I had the good fortune to read it. Joining us now this morning from Washington, the author, Douglas Wead. Thank you so much for getting up with us here on Canada AM. I have to say, this was a really interesting book to read. So many interesting stories from 200 years right up to the present. Tell me, which story to you is the most interesting story?
Ooh, I like the variety of all of them. Some of the girls' stories were more fascinating to me because they were under such pressure to perform. 11 times a first lady either died before her husband became president or died during the presidency or was invalid during the presidency, and suddenly the daughter had to act as de facto ceremonial head of state, and tremendous pressure, and it's why I think so many of them died young.
Interesting. Now, the genesis for this book came from a conversation that you had with the current president of the United States. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I've been talking about the subject with Bob Proctor and Sima Holt, who are dear friends for a long time, but I was working for George Herbert Walker Bush, the senior, in his '88 campaign, but my boss was George W. Bush, our current president. The election was over, and senior had won, and GW was talking about who goes to the White House, who goes to transition. We were sitting in his office, and he sighed real big, and he said, "Whoa, what's going to happen to me?" I said, "Well, you want me to do a memo on what happens to presidential kids?" And he said, "Sure." So that started it, and then 15 years later, here's the book.
It is very interesting to see. Now, about George W. Bush, he has actually been able to turn a certain kind of curse on its head that you talk a little bit about in the book, that being the sons of presidents who have been named directly after their fathers, like George Bush Jr. or John F. Kennedy Jr. Tell us a little bit about this curse as you saw it.
Ravi, that was a real startling thing to me. In most families, if you're named after your father or you're a firstborn, you're a high achiever. But among presidential kids, as you say, it's like a curse. I mean, John Adams II dies an alcoholic at 31. Andrew Johnson Jr. at 26. William Henry Harrison Jr. dies an alcoholic at 35. They die from accidents. They're self-destructive. Andrew Jackson Jr. dies after a hunting accident. Calvin Coolidge Jr. dies at the age of 16 after a freak accident on the White House tennis courts. I had written this study for George W., who was named after his father, turned it in, and 10 years later, John F. Kennedy Jr. disappeared over the Atlantic, and I had chills go down my spine. I thought, you know, this is not a coincidence of history. This has happened over and over and over again. There's pressure on these young kids because they're named after the father. From the time they're little children, people come up to them and say, well, when are you going to run for president? And those expectations apparently kill.
Well, there's only two that have actually made it, the current office holder and John Quincy Adams. What did George W. Bush do to turn that kind of curse, if you will, on its head?
Well, you know, Leo Tolstoy says everyone wants to change humanity, no one's willing to change themselves. And George W. woke up one morning in Colorado Springs, Colorado, and said, I will never take a drink again the rest of my life. And this had been brewing. He's a very decisive person by nature, which gets him in trouble as well as his strength. And he quit drinking, and it turned his life around and changed everything. And John Quincy Adams, the great breakthrough for him, a real aberration. His father took him to France when John Quincy was 10 years old. His father was a representative in France for the United States, and there they were, two future presidents of the United States in one room together, 10 years old and 40 years old, and there was a bonding there that gave John Quincy confidence for life. We know now in raising children the importance of singling out each child in a family one-on-one and having that special time with them.
Well, we could continue to talk about this for quite some time, but Douglas Wead, thank you so much for it. It's a great book, The American, All the President's Children, and thanks for taking the time.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll be right back here on Canada AM.